these political level points of progress meant almost nothing to the population on the ground, especially in the eastern provinces of Congo. And the reason for that is that even though you had the armies of Rwanda and Uganda withdraw their troops, you had a shift from that international conflict to what was really a proxy war. And on the one hand side, you had the Rwandans now supporting rebel movements in the Congo, and the Congolese government supporting those same Rwandan Hutu rebels, formerly part of the genocide, now called the FDLR. We'll talk a little bit about them this morning. And you had a conflict that sort of, as I kind of described before, in its initial phases in the 90s was really about geopolitics, shift into a war that was increasingly over control of these mineral resources. So here you have Laurent Nkunda, who was the leader of the Rwandan-backed rebel group, the CNDP. We talked a lot about this morning. And so you had continuing conflict there, and the sort of tendency towards these negotiations and integration of these rebel groups into the Congolese army, which kind of creates, again, peace agreements that don't actually mean anything on the ground. Because what's happening on the ground is that whether you're a rebel or whether you're in the Congolese army and you used to be a rebel, your objective remains the same, which, although there are many of them, predominantly one is to profit from and control economic resources. I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of the United States before turning it over to Fatima. This is Hillary Clinton out visiting Eastern Congo in August of 2009. Looking back at the history of Congo, especially at that Cold War era, and then also during the conflict, the U.S. was sort of perceived to be, and in some cases supporting Rwanda and Uganda. The history of the U.S. Involvement in this part of the world has more often than not been more harmful than helpful. And so there's that we got to sort of keep that history in mind, I think, as we now look at how can the United States play a positive and constructive role. Right now, thanks to, frankly, the legislation that was passed here in the United States, which was supported by grassroots efforts and by leaders in Congress, the United States has kind of, and thanks to Hillary Clinton's going out and actually kind of making commitments for the U.S. to do something positive and to do what it's trying to stop the violence in Eastern Congo. I think there's an opportunity for the U.S. to really play a leadership role in leading all of the efforts that we were sort of talking about in terms of how do you actually end this conflict. But it's not going to be easy. And I think maybe I'll save a lot of that for the Q&A and for conversations that we're going to have. But as we're looking ahead, we're going into yet another election year in Congo. The president, Joseph Kabila, has changed the law to make it much easier for him to be elected. You have a situation where all of the where this legislation is coming into effect, and so there is economic pressure to change the way that the extraction of natural resources has been fueling the conflict, but also an enormous effort by all of the vested interests who've been profiting from those resources to find loopholes and to keep doing what they have been doing. We can talk about how that plays into all of these conversations about bans versus livelihoods and all of that, I think, during the Q&A. But I'll stop there for now. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Fatima, and I just wanted, as I'm trying to load this presentation, go ahead and thank the sponsors for inviting me to speak on this, but also for all of you who are coming from different parts of the country it's awesome that you all are here. And what I want to try and do right now is talk about this in the next 15 minutes, which is absolutely ridiculous, but try and provide an overview to this serious human rights violation in the DRC, which is gender-based violence and that of sexual violence. But first I want to ground the conversation in understanding how violence is a part and parcel of society, particularly towards women, and then exploring how and why the DRC is so unique and why it is dubbed the rape capital of the world, and then explore some of the emerging trends that are coming through research, and by highlighting one proposed intervention, which is particularly relevant for all of you today, which is relating to conflict and liberation. So, violence against women is a universal crime and has persisted throughout human history. During times of conflict or instability, sexual violence is particularly acute and particularly affects women and girls. And part of this has to do with the resulting breakdown of social networks and formal institutions that were constructed to protect women and children from this. When we think of violence against women in conflict, we often associate it with genocide and ethnic cleansing in Rwanda and Bosnia and Darfur, some would say too. But it's also part of this situation in DRC, and it's not just rape, it also encompasses sexual slavery, forced pregnancy, forced sterilization, assault, trafficking, forced sex work. It's just an unreasonable number of ways and forms that it can take. And this is actually a picture of women who are at the Panzi clinic in DRC, in eastern DRC. And what we see is that some of the women are actually pregnant, and that's a result of their rape. Rape has also been documented in other recent conflicts in Africa, such as in Liberia and Sierra Leone. And so what is it about DRC that makes it particularly egregious and particularly different from previous instances? There's been a tremendous amount of attention on gender-based violence in DRC. It's gotten the attention of activists, all of you here today, researchers, policymakers, even celebrities. And so, in 2008, the Security Council proclaimed in a resolution 1820 that sexual violence poses a threat to peace and security. In 2010, we saw Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the UN, appoint a special representative on sexual violence and conflict. And so clearly we're seeing that it's a huge issue, and what is it that's about DRC that's prompted this? And so when you do research or when you do any type of background analysis on DRC, some of the two common phrases that you're going to come across are rape capital of the world and rape as a weapon of war. When you think about sexual violence in DRC, it's arguably regarded as one of the worst situations in the world, both in terms of scale and brutality. At this point, I want to issue a caveat that all the numbers that I'm going to be telling you right now should be taken with a grain of salt, not a salt, because it's difficult to get precise numbers on this. You are depending on, and the ethical thing to do is to count who comes forward, and in a context where there's such stigma associated with reporting sexual violence, you have to realize that this is just the tip of the iceberg. And also, in places of conflict, it is difficult to gather data because it's just too unstable and insecure for humanitarian organizations to reach. And so, despite this uncertainty, we do know that the UN has accounted 200,000 cases of sexual assaults from 1996. And even though the war officially ended in 2003, incidents of sexual violence has skyrocketed.